Covert narcissism doesn't always leave obvious scars, but when it comes from your mother, it often shapes how you move through the world long after childhood ends. Hey everyone, I'm Elena and welcome back to What Was Meant. When I released 10 signs of the covertly narcissistic mother that she trained you to overlook, the comments flooded in. Stories, realizations, and a lot of light bulb moments as so many of you instantly related to the signs that were covered. Many of you weren't just recognizing your childhood, you were recognizing your relationships, your boundaries, and the patterns you struggled with as an adult. If you've already seen that one, consider this the continuation. And if you haven't watched it yet, I recommend checking it out after this. I've linked it in the comments. In that first video, we covered 10 of the more visible signs of a covertly narcissistic mother. Signs 11 through 20 are the quieter, more confusing tactics, the ones that may not have registered as abuse at the time, but shaped how you learn to relate, to attach, to set boundaries, and see yourself well into adulthood. This video is for anyone who grew up with a covertly narcissistic mother, sons and daughters alike. The details may look different, but the patterns are the same. And recognition is the first step toward healing, so let's move into the next layer. Sign number 11, selective amnesia. Selective amnesia is a specific form of gaslighting. It's when a covertly narcissistic mother remembers what protects her self-image and conveniently forgets what will require accountability. This isn't simple forgetfulness. It's a pattern where harm, silence, or neglect is minimized, ignored, or rewritten after the fact, often in subtle ways. Years after I went no contact, my mother wrote to me and said, "Sometimes our perception of how things are or were is not always totally clear. I was disturbed that you thought I never tried to help." If you, like me, have ever received a letter or statement like this, notice what's happening here. No specific action is named. No help is described. No protection or intervention is acknowledged because none of those things occurred. Instead, the focus quietly shifts away from what actually happened and onto whether your memory can be trusted. Doubt is introduced about your perception, and concern is implied without accountability or evidence. That's selective amnesia. The harm goes unaddressed, and the person who remembers clearly is left defending their reality. In a comment on the second video about my mother's letters, a viewer described how her covertly narcissistic grandmother would say, "I don't understand why you distanced yourself," even though she'd explained the issues repeatedly. This is selective amnesia. You may recognize this same pattern in phrases like, "I did the best I could," or "we'll just have to agree to disagree." Nothing specific is acknowledged, nothing is repaired. Intent replaces impact. And if you push back, you're made to feel unreasonable, ungrateful, or unfair. When selective amnesia is part of your upbringing, it doesn't stop in childhood. In adulthood, it often shows up as chronic self-doubt, second-guessing your memory, your reactions, and your right to name harm. You may over-explain yourself, hesitate to trust your instincts, or feel compelled to gather proof before taking your own feelings seriously. Selective amnesia teaches you to question your memory instead of the behavior. And once that happens, rewriting your story becomes much easier, which brings me to the next sign. Sign number 12, rewriting your childhood narrative. Rewriting your childhood narrative is when your lived experience is replaced with her version of events, one that preserves her role as a good parent, even when it doesn't match what you actually lived. In the same letter I referenced earlier, my mother went on to address the sexual abuse I was subjected to as a child. She wrote, "The truth came out only long after your uncle was gone. Your dad tried to find out where he was, but could not. When we finally heard anything, he was in California." That version bears no resemblance to reality. When I disclosed the abuse at 11, I was blamed for it, told I was not allowed to be angry, and that same uncle was later invited into our home with instructions for me to be respectful to him. None of that appears in her story. Instead, the narrative is rewritten to suggest concern and protection, not because that's what happened, but because the truth does not fit the image that she needs to maintain. Reality is replaced with a version that protects her self-image while erasing what you actually went through. Another way rewriting your childhood narrative often shows up is in phrases like, "We were a happy family," followed closely by, "and everything you went through made you strong." On the surface, those statements sound positive, even comforting, but together they create a very specific rewrite. "We were a happy family" smooths over tension, fear, neglect, or emotional chaos, replacing your lived experience with a clean, socially acceptable story. And when that version doesn't fully explain your pain, "that made you strong" finishes the job. The harm isn't acknowledged, it's reframed. Pain becomes proof of resilience. Survival becomes justification. There's no space to name what you weren't protected from, no room to grieve what you didn't receive. Instead, your childhood is repackaged as both happy and necessary. That's rewriting your childhood narrative. Your reality is edited into a version that preserves the image, while the impact on you quietly disappears. In adulthood, this often shows up as second guessing your feelings, minimizing your own pain, or struggling to trust your memory when something feels wrong. You may downplay mistreatment, tolerate unhealthy dynamics, or feel guilty for naming harm because you were taught that the story matters more than your experience. Rewriting your childhood narrative usually happens later, once you're grown and the story is being retold. But the next sign is something you lived in real time. Sign number 13, invisible standards you can never meet. Invisible standards are expectations that are never clearly stated, constantly shifting, and impossible to satisfy. You're expected to just know what's required, and when you don't, you're criticized or made to feel deficient. When I was 16 years old, my parents suggested I get a job to help pay for my expenses. So I applied for a job with a children's photographer and was hired as an assistant. When I told my parents, they became angry and accused me of betraying my father since he had a photography business, even though he didn't work with kids. Then they grounded me and forced me to quit, even though later working at a grocery store was not a problem. After that, I threw myself into religious activities, spending 70 to 80 hours a month in field service, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses call going door to door.
Hi, my name's Peter. I'm a Jehovah's Witness here to spread the good news of the story of Jesus Christ.
Okay, go ahead.
Really? Wow. Boy, you're the first person who didn't slam the door on me.
Even though this was right up my mother's alley, as soon as my parents saw me developing a friendship with a sister from our congregation who I'd partnered up with, they put a stop to that also. So the standard was never really about behavior, it was about control. And this doesn't just stay in childhood. Many adults who are raised with invisible standards carry a chronic feeling of falling short even when they're doing well. You work hard, you show up, you try to do the right thing, and yet there's this constant sense that you're missing something no one ever explained, and that no matter how hard you work, you'll never be good enough. That's what invisible standards do. They don't teach you how to succeed, they train you to doubt yourself. And when you're raised to constantly guess what's expected of you, setting clear boundaries later in life often feels dangerous. And that's exactly where the next sign shows up. Sign number 14, she treats your boundaries as a personal rejection. Instead of seeing boundaries as healthy or necessary, the covertly narcissistic mother experiences them as abandonment, disrespect, or betrayal. Your limits aren't heard as needs, they're taken personally and often used to guilt or punish you. You'll often see this show up once you build a life of your own, especially in your marriage or your parenting. You set a boundary around decisions that belong to you and your partner, how you parent, how you spend holidays, how often you visit, or what behavior is acceptable around your children. Instead of respecting that boundary, your mother reacts emotionally. She says you've changed, that your spouse is controlling you, or that you're shutting her out and breaking her heart. The boundary itself is never discussed. The focus shifts to her feelings about no longer being centered, and you're left defending your right to make decisions for your own family. I want to share a personal example here because this one was especially painful and it involved our children. When Eric and I got engaged, his mother told him not to have children with me because she didn't want interracial grandchildren. He didn't tell me this right away because it was incredibly ignorant and he hoped she'd change. In her case, she was more overt, but she had some covertly narcissistic tendencies as well. After our children were born, she treated them poorly, making racist remarks and speaking to them in ways that were abusive and inappropriate. When Eric finally drew a clear boundary and told her that her behavior toward our children would no longer be tolerated, she didn't reflect or apologize. She came to our house, yelled at me, pushed me, and said she could treat our children any way she wanted. When I told her that wasn't okay and that we could work things out, she snapped back that she wanted nothing to do with our kids anymore and left. She treated a boundary meant to protect our children as a personal rejection. And when she wasn't allowed to overstep, she chose to walk away instead. That was incredibly hurtful, especially for Eric, because it meant watching his mother reject his children, not because of anything they did, but because her access and control had limits. When a covertly narcissistic parent treats boundaries as rejection, the goal isn't resolution, it's control. In adulthood, this often shows up as guilt around saying no, especially in close relationships. You may over-explain your boundaries, soften them, or abandon them altogether to avoid being seen as cold, selfish, or hurtful. And even when a boundary is reasonable, you might feel responsible for other people's emotional reactions to it. That's the adult impact of this pattern. You were taught to put your boundaries on the back burner in order to keep the peace. And someone who requires you to put your boundaries on the back burner will often only show up for you when it serves their image, which brings us to the next sign. Sign number 15, performative concern only when others are watching. Performative concern is when care, worry, or protection shows up primarily in public or in front of other people, but is inconsistent, disingenuous, or non-existent behind closed doors. The concern isn't about your well-being, it's about how your mother is perceived. When I was 17 years old, my father hit me in the head and knocked me down twice because I wore one of his sweatshirts without asking. Not long after that, I started having severe headaches and had to see a doctor. My mother took me to the doctor's appointment and played the role of the concerned parent. When it was determined I'd suffered a concussion and should have an MRI, she agreed and scheduled it. Before the MRI could happen, I came home from school one day to a visibly angry mother. She'd received the initial bill, just over $300, and snapped at me about how much I was costing them and how she didn't want to pay for the MRI. Her concern existed in front of the doctors, but at home I was treated like a burden. You might recognize this pattern when your mother appears caring and attentive in front of teachers, doctors, church members, or extended family, asking the right questions, expressing worry, and playing the role of the devoted parent. But once the audience is gone, the tone changes. You're minimized, you're blamed for the inconvenience, or you're made to feel like your needs are too much. The care disappears, but the image stays intact. When care was performative in childhood, it leaves a lasting imprint. In adulthood, you may struggle to ask for help, minimize your own needs, or feel uncomfortable receiving care unless it's public or justified. You might learn to downplay your mental health by masking your pain around others, because attention only feels safe if something is visibly broken. And over time, you may notice that support feels inconsistent, present when the hurt is clearly visible, absent when it's not. That's the bridge to the next sign, when support is only given under certain conditions. Sign number 16, conditional support. Conditional support means you're encouraged, helped, or affirmed only when your choices align with your mother's preferences or expectations. The moment you choose differently, support is withdrawn, sometimes quietly, sometimes punitively. If you grew up with a deeply religious mother, this one may be especially familiar.
Well, isn't that special?
When my choices aligned with my mother's values and her religion's expectations, I was tolerated. When they didn't, or even loosely fell outside those expectations, support was withdrawn or turned punitive. For example, when my high school's football coach, who was also my science teacher, asked me to help manage the team and I accepted, it wasn't explicitly forbidden by our religion. But my mother treated it as a violation anyway, reporting me to the elders in our Jehovah's Witness congregation for falling outside of the broad definition of good association. The elders met with me privately and warned that riding the team bus would lead to immoral behavior since I would be around male players, shifting the standard after the fact and turning something wholesome, helping the football team, into something nefarious with no basis. I responded by asking them to show me the scripture in the Bible that said, "Thou shalt not be a football manager," and this did not make them happy. In this case, my mother had enlisted the elders to make it clear that support and acceptance was tied to compliance. And I wouldn't be seen as good or acceptable unless I abdicated my autonomy and followed their narrow version of what was okay. Outside of religious context, conditional support often shows up financially. You might see this when a parent agrees to pay for college, but only if you choose a major they approve of. If you pursue something prestigious or familiar, such as law, medicine, or business, the support stays. But if you choose something that doesn't fit their vision, like the culinary arts or a creative field, the money disappears. This sends a clear message. You're supported as long as you're living the life they want. This is why you so often hear contestants on cooking or creative competition shows say their parent isn't proud of them, not because they failed, but because they didn't fulfill the role their parent wanted to live through vicariously.
Micah, unfortunately, Mum and Dad can't be here, but tonight, you're not alone, okay? You're with us. You're with the MasterChef family. Remember that, okay?
My culinary dream has never really been positively looked on by anyone in my family. So it's hard. Everybody else is, in the arms of their families. And I'm here the second time with no one in my corner.
Stand strong.
That's conditional support. Love, approval, and help are offered, but only when your life choices reflect their identity, not yours. When support was conditional growing up, it reshapes how you relate to approval in adulthood. You may find yourself measuring your worth by how useful, compliant, or impressive you are, rather than by who you are. You might hesitate to pursue what actually fulfills you, fearing that choosing differently will cost you connection, approval, or safety. Over time, love starts to feel transactional, something you earn by staying in line. And when you finally do choose yourself, that clarity is often reframed as cruelty, which brings us to the next sign. Sign number 17, reframing self-respect as cruelty. This is when basic self-respect, like having standards, expectations, or limits, is labeled as selfish, harsh, or unkind. You're made to feel like demanding more for yourself is somehow a moral failure. Growing up, I watched my mother actively accept and participate in harmful dynamics and present them as normal, acceptable, and something to put up with. Because of that, I decided early on that if I ever got married, I would not repeat what I'd grown up around. And by the time I'd gotten engaged, I'd already won in many ways. Eric was nothing like the toxic men I'd been raised around. He wasn't abusive, he wasn't volatile, he wasn't unsafe. In fact, he was the opposite, loving, considerate, and a wonderful man who I look forward to spending the rest of my life with. But when we were engaged and living in a downtown Seattle high-rise apartment with a doorman, I was working full-time, financially stable, and carrying responsibility, while he was going to school part-time and working very limited hours at a local grocery store. One night when he came home and told me his supervisor had scheduled him for just 9 hours the following week, I told him plainly that if he didn't get a real job, I wouldn't marry him. That wasn't control. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. When my mother found out I'd given him that ultimatum, she tried to reframe my expectation as mean, and she told me I was wrong. Instead of seeing this as holding healthy standards, she treated it like it was a character flaw. It was clear that she thought that her attempt at taking his side would ingratiate her to Eric, when in fact, he didn't see what I said as cruelty. He took it very seriously, and it motivated positive change. When you grow up with a covertly narcissistic mother, you're taught to accept the bare minimum and to subjugate yourself to others, to stay in your place and not expect more out of life. As an adult, you may recognize this when you start setting standards in your own life, in relationships, work, or how you allow yourself to be treated. I've received several comments where viewers have shared that even after they left abusive partners, their mothers chose to side with the abuser rather than support their child's decision to protect themselves. Instead of support, you're told you're too demanding, too rigid, too unforgiving. The boundary isn't examined, the behavior you're responding to isn't questioned, you are. Reframing self-respect as cruelty trains you to abandon your standards to keep the peace. And over time, it teaches you that choosing yourself is too much or something you should feel ashamed of. Like so many things in dealing with narcissistic parents, it keeps you small, which is the opposite of what a healthy parent would want for you. And when keeping yourself small becomes the expectation, the next tool often used to keep you there is guilt, which brings us to the next sign. Sign number 18, chronic helplessness that keeps you emotionally hooked. Chronic helplessness is when your mother consistently presents herself as incapable, overwhelmed, or unable to cope in ways that quietly shift responsibility for her emotional or physical well-being onto you. Over time, this conditions you to feel guilty for pulling away, even when doing so was healthy and necessary. In my case, this narrative existed long before I had any choice in the matter. My maternal grandmother died before I was born, and I was raised with the story of the responsibility and burden that loss placed on my mother. That story became a constant backdrop, a standing explanation for her behavior, her emotional volatility, and her failure to protect me in an abusive household. It wasn't framed as context, it was framed as justification. Her helplessness was treated as a permanent condition, one that excused harm and demanded understanding from everyone around her, especially me. And that same narrative didn't stop when I went no contact. Even years later, those circumstances were used again, this time as a blanket absolution, in an attempt to guilt me into reconnecting. The message was consistent. What she went through mattered more than what she put me through. Her helplessness was positioned as my responsibility indefinitely. In the comments, many of you have described a similar pattern when a mother develops health issues or ongoing struggles later in life. Those issues, real or exaggerated, become the reason you're expected to stay, comply, and tolerate behavior that would otherwise be unacceptable. You're told she can't handle stress or take care of herself, that boundaries would be cruel, that pulling away would harm her. Illness or hardship becomes the justification for continued emotional abuse, and your role quietly shifts from child to caretaker without boundaries or limits. Your needs are deferred, hers are urgent. And this is where I want to highlight something one of you said so powerfully. A viewer on my Breaking Free video, Wolfric Wolfblood 3333, summed it up perfectly when he said the following. No title should give you entitlement. The title of parent should not give them entitlement to our continued subservience to their abuse. That's the heart of this sign. Chronic helplessness works because it leans on title, mother, parent, family, to demand sacrifice, obedience, and silence while sidestepping accountability. It teaches you that love requires you to surrender your dignity and peace in service to someone who feels entitled to your care and attention while failing to reciprocate that care, protection, or respect. Chronic helplessness keeps you emotionally tethered through guilt, not connection. And once guilt has done its job, once the door is cracked back open, the next demand is usually forgiveness without anything actually changing. This takes us to the next sign. Sign number 19. She expects forgiveness without change and calls it moving on. This is when forgiveness is demanded as a way to reset the relationship without accountability or repair. You're expected to let go, move on, or be the bigger person while the underlying behavior remains unchanged. In my case, this showed up as a blanket non-apology apology a few years after I went no contact. My mother wrote that she was sorry for, quote, whatever I have done to cause you hurt, pain, or sorrow, like she had no idea why it set that boundary. Notice what's missing. No specific harm is named, no behavior is acknowledged, no responsibility is taken. She went on to say, no one can change the past, unfortunately. Although deep disappointments and painful memories can haunt us and sometimes even cripple us, however, we have to find a way to mend and forgive. Forgiveness was expected of me, but nothing was to be expected of her. The message was clear. If I required her to actually take accountability for the harm she caused, I was the problem, not the harm itself. Many of you will recognize this in phrases like, I've already apologized, what more do you want? That was a long time ago. Why can't you just let it go? Or, you need to be the bigger person. Forgiveness is treated like a reset button, not the result of reflection, accountability, or change. And if you ask for acknowledgement, repair, or a different behavior going forward, you're accused of holding grudges or refusing to move on. Healing is reframed as your responsibility, while nothing is asked of your mother. But here's the thing. Forgiveness without change isn't healing, it's erasure. And when moving on is demanded without accountability, what's really being asked is that you abandon your truth to preserve her comfort. When forgiveness was demanded without change, it shapes how you handle conflict in adulthood. You may feel pressure to move on quickly, minimize harm, or accept apologies that come without accountability, just to keep the peace. You might second guess yourself for wanting repair, clarity, or different behavior going forward, as if those needs are unreasonable. That's the lasting impact of this pattern. You were taught that reconciliation matters more than repair, and that your discomfort is the price of harmony. And when accountability is consistently avoided, The next pattern often shows up at the most vulnerable moments, right when you're stepping into something new. Sign number 20, undermining you right before milestones. A covertly narcissistic mother often creates chaos right before major milestones, not by saying no outright, but by delaying, stalling, or withdrawing support at the last possible moment. It keeps you anxious, dependent, and focused on managing the crisis instead of enjoying your life. For my example, I want to slow this one down because it mattered. And I know many of you will recognize this pattern immediately. When Eric and I got engaged, we sat down with both sets of parents and talked through our wedding plans. Everyone agreed that each set of parents would cover a quarter of the cost, and Eric and I would pay the remaining half. But every time a payment was due to the wedding venue, my parents would stall. They'd hem and haw, delay, create tension. And my father in particular seemed to enjoy it, openly commenting on how everyone's waiting on us. After the first time this happened, I went to my mother and said I was thinking about getting a second job so they wouldn't have to pay anything at all. I just wanted the stress gone. She told me not to do that, not to worry, that they would absolutely uphold their end of the bargain. And for some reason, I trusted that. Then came the Friday before our Sunday evening wedding. The final payment was due. I called my mother and asked for their portion, and she casually told me they couldn't pay it. Instead, she told me to call the wedding venue and tell them we'd pay the balance after the wedding, the following Thursday. I remember feeling stunned, embarrassed, and suddenly very small. All I could think of was that old Popeye cartoon character, Wimpy, who said,
"I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today."
This was my wedding 2 days away. Eric and I had no choice. We called his parents, explained what had happened, and thankfully, they stepped in and paid the balance with the understanding that my parents would reimburse them. When I told my mother that Eric's parents had paid, she wasn't concerned about the stress she caused us. She was furious that I'd gone to them. I asked her what she expected me to do instead, and she didn't have an answer. And that's the point. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't about money. It was about undermining me at a major milestone, right when I was stepping into a whole new life and making sure that stress, dependence, and humiliation were part of the experience. And weddings aren't the only place this shows up. You might recognize it in other milestones. Maybe your mother promised to help with childcare when you returned to work and pulled out at the last minute. Maybe she said she'd support your move, your education, or your medical decision, and then suddenly became unavailable, vague, or non-committal when the moment arrived. Often, the help is offered just long enough to keep you from making other plans and withdrawn at the exact moment when you're most exposed. Not early enough to adjust and not late enough to avoid damage. The result is the same. Stress replaces celebration, and you're left scrambling to manage a crisis instead of marking a milestone. And it shows up in other oddly specific ways in adulthood. If you grew up with this pattern, you may notice that you brace for things to fall apart whenever something good is about to happen. You overplan. You hesitate to rely on anyone. You struggle to accept help, or you feel anxious when you do. Even during moments that should feel joyful, there's often a familiar sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and you feel dread at getting your hopes up. That's not intuition, that's conditioning. Undermining you right before milestones trains your nervous system to associate progress with chaos and independence with punishment. And once you see that pattern clearly, you can stop mistaking sabotage for bad luck and start protecting your peace at the moments that matter most. So that wraps up signs 11 through 20 that you, just like me, might have a covertly narcissistic mother. And if you recognize yourself here, not just in the childhood examples, but in how these patterns have shown up in your adult life, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not imagining it, and you're not alone. The impact of covert narcissistic behavior isn't always obvious. It's subtle, it's confusing, and because it's so often wrapped in guilt, obligation, and the expectation that you should be understanding, it can take years to see it clearly. Many of us learn to question ourselves, minimize our needs, or carry responsibility that was never ours. That doesn't mean something was wrong with you. It means you adapted to what you were given. And here's what I want to leave you with. Awareness changes everything. Once you see a pattern clearly, you get to choose differently. You get to protect your peace. You get to decide what you carry and what you finally put down. If this video resonated with you, please share your thoughts and experiences. I read all of your comments, and you never know who might feel seen because you spoke up. Also, please like and consider subscribing. Right now, the majority of people watching haven't subscribed, and subscribing really does help the algorithm understand that this kind of content matters. In upcoming videos, we'll continue exploring healing, growth, and building a meaningful life after trauma and beyond survival. We're in this together, and I'd love to have you along for those as well. Until then, my name is Elena, and this is What Was Meant. Thank you for watching, and have an awesome day.